Okay, so I think we're going to get started because there's quite a few attendees who have been on here for a long time, so I don't want to keep anyone else waiting. For those who don't know me or haven't met me, my name is Amina Dib. I'm a Programs and Policy Analyst at RESCON. Shameful brag, I am the planner of this event. And I'm going to kick it off to Richard, who's going to deliver some opening remarks. So Richard, without further ado.
Amina, sorry, I just remembered I had to shut off my phone there. But anyways, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Richard Lyle, President of the Residential Construction Council of Ontario, RESCON. Thank you for attending our Addressing Racism in Construction webinar. As many of you know, earlier this summer, there were several incidents of nooses located on construction sites in the GTA. RESCON remains appalled by this racist symbol targeted against the Black community. We unequivocally condemn these acts. RESCON and its members adamantly believe that these are acts of cowardice, and racism has no place in our industry or society. Our industry has zero tolerance for racism and discrimination of any kind or in any form. We are proud of our multiracial and multicultural construction workforce, and we welcome all to our industry. We strongly believe that these incidents in no way exemplify the more than 400,000 people who work in Ontario's construction industry or the thousands of employers that employ them. However, events this summer highlight the fact that racism and discrimination are issues that our industry still needs to address. We need to come together in a united front. Together, we can proactively rather than reactively create a long-term strategic plan to address root issues and move forward as an industry. Last week, we had an opportunity to attend a roundtable with the Mayor of Toronto, John Tory. We discussed the issue and our commitment and plans to address racism. The Mayor and I agreed that action must be taken to educate the industry, raise awareness about the issue, and work towards changing the culture. I strongly believe that this change must and can only come from the top. Today's webinar marks the official launch of RESCON's anti-racism strategy, and in addition to today's event, we are also spearheading the CARE campaign, which means Construction Against Racism Everywhere, which includes visual aids that will be circulated to our members and the construction industry to post on job sites, on hard hats, trucks, etc. We will also be launching an anti-racism steering committee, which will bring together employers, unions, and government to create a strategic plan focused on diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism in construction. RESCON will continue to do all that it can to ensure that these racist occurrences are not repeated on construction sites, and we will work with industry, unions, municipal, and provincial governments to accomplish this. Thank you, and I look forward to the coming proceedings.
Thank you, Richard. Without further ado, let's get started with today's program. First, we'll hear from Diane Laranja, who's a partner at Filion Wakely. She'll have a presentation, and attendees will have the opportunity to have some questions answered. Then we'll have a panel discussion featuring Jason Audie of Leona 183, Danielle Fiedler of Tridel, and Fatima Saya of Daniels. So without further ado, Diane.
Thanks, Amina. As she had said, and I want to also thank Richard for the wonderful introduction to both today's programming, but also our future plans. And racism, and particularly anti-Black racism, is a difficult but long overdue conversation. And I think many of us welcome the opportunity to approach that discussion and to provide our contributions in whatever way that may be. And it may feel uncomfortable, and it may feel like a topic that many of us don't feel is necessary on our particular work sites, for example, or in our particular interactions with others. But this is an issue that cannot and will not be delayed any further. And we, of course, have seen and heard about the recent incidences that Richard briefly described that occurred on construction sites that have resulted in a police investigation and, of course, media coverage, but ultimately resulted in hurt and offended employees and perhaps feelings of isolation that we shouldn't be ignoring. And only time will tell, what exposure or what result from these scenarios or the incidences. But we're hoping that it forces us to have this long overdue discussion. Now, I certainly don't profess to be an expert in anti-Black racism. And quite frankly, I don't want to appear as if I have the agency to describe what may be very difficult experiences that have been felt by those around us. But we all have a part to play in the discussion. And certainly we all have a role in pushing forward the agenda on eliminating racism. And so I will be discussing today the legal landscape and operating through the legal lens as an employer. What is our obligation as an employer when addressing or responding to anti-Black racism? And then there will be the panel after me who will be launchpad by that legal landscape and get more into the non-legal elements of addressing anti-Black racism. But certainly following the incidences and what we are seeing as recent events in both the US and Canada and across the world is many employers are asking the two key questions. What should I be doing and what am I required to do in the workplace in regards to racism in the workplace? And what do I do if I have something that is classified as racism that happens in my workplace? And so that's what we're going to briefly talk about today. Now, I think should start with a discussion about, well, what is racism? And I think many people hear the term racism and will want to disassociate themselves or their behavior from the term racism. But I think we need to first have a reflective look on what the term means and what it covers. Now, racism or being racist is not defined in any legislation anywhere, including in the Human Rights Code. But the Ontario Human Rights Commission has provided a definition as a guideline. And so as you'll see, I will be speaking without slides, but will be turning to slides where I think it may be helpful. And I'll pop up the definition that is provided by the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and I think should guide our discussion. Racism is an ideology that either directly or indirectly asserts that one group is inherently superior to others. And so it's not, it can be direct, it can be indirect, but it is rooted in this concept. There is a group of people, i.e. white people, who are inherently superior to others. So it could be Black people, it could be Indigenous people, it could be people of color. This can be openly displayed in racial jokes, in slurs, and then of course the more extreme scenarios of hate crimes. But that conduct or those comments are deeply rooted in attitudes or values or stereotypical beliefs of people as a group. And then there's the element of systematic racism, where there may be unconsciously held and deeply embedded beliefs or assumptions or barriers in our systems and in our institutions that have evolved over time. So there may be institutions like the criminal justice system, the education system, and even work opportunities for either advancement or promotion that has deeply rooted beliefs and that results in a racist structure. So racism can operate at a number of levels, in particular our individual interactions, our societal interactions, as well as the systems and the institutions that we have in place. So I'm going to go back. Now, many believe, and it has been ill-advisedly said that racism does not exist in Canada, and that's simply not the case. And in fact, the belief that there is little racism in Canada is only a barrier to addressing it. And the only way we can have this discussion, including how do we deal with it in our workplaces, involves an open acknowledgement that racism continues to exist. And in December of last year, the Canadian Race Relations Foundation published the results of a survey to measure the attitudes and perceptions of both racial and non-racialized Canadians. And the survey confirmed that the reality is that racial discrimination in Canada continues to exist, is widely acknowledged, although some people do not or refuse to acknowledge that racism exists. And that was seen as a real barrier in people's ability or willingness to address or tackle the issues. And so, as I said earlier, the recent events we have seen demonstrate that racism continues and also continues, unfortunately, or presents itself in the construction industry. So we have to be ready to tackle that. And as well as in December of last year, I found an interesting study demonstrating the demographics of the construction workforce in Ontario. And at least the information that I saw demonstrated that visible minorities accounted for 11% of Ontario's unionized construction sector and 17% of the non-unionized sector. And where they saw a real distinction or a difference in the numbers were higher rates of unemployment and workplace racism and discrimination, which we'll talk about, as well as low representation in leadership positions. So I'll be talking today about workplace racism and discrimination and what an employer's obligation is. But something we should be thinking about in the back of our mind is beyond our obligations, how to tackle issues like low representation in leadership positions and how to attract and retain visible minorities in our workforces. Now, when it comes to those who experienced racism, so in another survey, there were, among the individuals who reported racism, 38% of those individuals reported experience with discrimination that they experienced in the workplace. So of those who have experienced discrimination, racial discrimination, they say that that occurred in the workplace. And so certainly, and I'll say the other predominant area where they experienced discrimination was dealing with the police. And actually was fairly comparable when people reported dealing with racism and dealing with the police as well as the workplace. So very much we have to consider this an issue that requires tackling. So I'm going to start, with that in mind. The question then becomes, well, how do we tackle it from a legal perspective? What are our legal obligations? And the first natural place to start is what I referred to earlier, the Ontario Human Rights Code, which applies to every provincial workplace in Ontario. We as an employer have an obligation under the Ontario Human Rights Code to ensure that employees are not experiencing discrimination on the basis of what's called a protective ground. Now, I'll share to show you what the protective grounds are to illustrate how expansive this list may be. So you'll see the code prohibits discrimination in employment on the basis of, and you'll see that race is specifically included under the code, but that's not the end of it, right? We have also ancestry, place of origin, color, ethnic origin, citizenship, and sometimes what we find overlapping creed. So it's very important when we're considering how to establish or maintain an anti-racist workplace that our policies and our practices and our focus demonstrates, and certainly the discussion is and should be on race, but race also may overlap with a number of the other protected grounds. let me just. Now, when it comes to these protected grounds, the code has what I would characterize as 4 key obligations. The first is to refrain from discriminatory practices. This is the most obvious form, right? We don't want to refuse to hire someone or refuse to promote someone because they're, say, Black, and we don't want to hire someone or advance someone because they're white. That is the most obvious form, and I'll say less prevalent form of racism, and that's the easier one to address because if it's blatant, you can easily tackle it. The second prohibition under the code is to accommodate a person to the point of undue hardship. That's more relevant when it comes to disability. The third requirement under the Ontario Human Rights Code is to provide a workplace or a working environment free from discrimination or harassment. That is the most, I would say, challenging when it comes to racism, because it is about establishing and maintaining not just your policies, but an environment that is free from harassment and discrimination. And so that we'll focus on that in a bit. And the fourth requirement is to not retaliate against an employee who exercises their rights under a code. So that includes disciplining, not disciplining someone who raises a good faith complaint about discrimination in the workplace. Now, when it comes to an employer's liability, employers have an obligation to ensure that employers are not experiencing discrimination in employment on the basis of a code protected ground, and the code imposes liability for employers for the discriminatory actions of their employees, and that's key. It's not enough to say, well, I didn't discriminate against this individual, or I didn't create this environment. It was their colleagues or their coworkers. We as the employer are responsible for the environment that we are establishing and that we are maintaining. Much of that comes from the policies we have in place, or some of it comes from the policies we have in place, but much of it comes from the enforcement or the supervision of that environment. So certainly the necessary starting point is to have the appropriate policies in place, but it goes beyond that as far as setting the tone among our workers, responding to instances, and proactively assessing whether or not we have created and maintained a harassment and discrimination-free working environment. Now, discrimination is a term that includes both direct and indirect discrimination. So I'm going to share my screen again. And in fact, I may leave it up moving forward. There's no fixed definition of racial discrimination, as I had outlined earlier, but it can be direct or indirect. So direct discrimination arises when an employer overtly discriminates against a group of people, right? You have a policy of not hiring individuals from a particular ethnic group, for example. We see less of that, but it still can happen, especially when it comes to conduct or comments. What we are increasingly seeing and what people are less comfortable with dealing or acknowledging is this concept of indirect discrimination, particularly when it's unintentional, where an employer, say, has a policy in place that applies to all employees and that seems fair, but actually causes people to be treated differently. So I take, for example, a policy where our workers must be clean shaven. Okay, it applies to everyone equally, but it will have an effect on those who, for example, prescribe to a creed that expects or where they do not shave their facial hair. So that's an example of something that applies to everyone equally, but that results in an undue burden to certain people based on either their race, their ethnic origin, or their creed. And so what I want to highlight here is that racial discrimination does not have to be intentional. Sometimes we see scenarios where an employer or a colleague or an individual says, oh, we were just joking, or everyone knew it was a joke, or we make jokes about everyone's background, or he, even that person made the joke and he had laughed too. Or I asked those questions because I was genuinely curious. And I'm hopeful that this encourages us to step away from those types of justifications, because ultimately the decision is not whether you intended to offend someone. The decision is not whether you intended to discriminate against someone. The question will always be, what type of environment was that individual subjected to? And what are the comments or the conduct or the jokes that that person had to endure that others who were of not that race were not subjected to? Now, some examples of racial discrimination include stereotyping, right? Making an assumption about someone before meeting that person simply because of, say, their race or ethnic origin, racial profiling, and then, as I say, the subtle racial discrimination. And where we see that is on jokes, on questions, right? Like some questions people ask about their personal lives, or nicknames that we give to someone in the workplace. That's all subtle, but certainly is inappropriate and shouldn't be tolerated. And then that rises or helps contribute to this concept of a poisoned environment. And so those are all examples that we need to be aware of. And certainly the code, so as I mentioned earlier, the code prohibits discrimination, and it also prohibits harassment. Every person who is employee has a right to be free from harassment in the workplace. Now, the workplace includes not only just your work site, but events that occur outside the physical workplace or outside of regular work hours. So that can include business trips. That can include our Christmas parties. That can include our different types of functions. All of that may contribute to what is considered the workplace when determining if somebody was subjected to harassment in the workplace. So we have to be mindful of not just, the conduct and the behavior that we should be expecting on our work sites, but also in other scenarios where our employees may be interacting with one another. Now, harassment is a course of comment or conduct that is known or ought to have reasonably have been known to be unwelcome. And so I want to go back to what I had said about, well, I was just joking, or I didn't mean it, or I didn't actually think that about, say, Black people. I was making a joke, or I didn't mean to offend him. And quite frankly, none of those responses are a complete answer to harassment. It's whether it was actually known by the individual to be unwelcome or should have been known by the individual to be unwelcome. And so while certainly the person who is being said to be the harasser's knowledge is important, we're really looking at the perspective of the person who's being subjected to the comments and the conduct. So we have to remember that when we are dealing with a situation where someone has made comments or engaged in conduct, if the person is telling us, oh no, I didn't mean it, that doesn't end our responsibility. We have to really consider the effect that it had on the other person and what steps should be taken to address that effect. And so this includes things like slurs, jokes, name calling, nicknames, also includes cartoons or graffiti, comments ridiculing individuals because of their race-related characteristics or because of, say, religious dress. It also includes singling out an individual for teasing or jokes related to their race or ancestry or place of origin. It also includes inappropriate references to racist organizations as part of a joke or not. That can rise to the level of harassment. And certainly we see this less in the construction industry, but circulating racial offensive jokes, if you heard it in the trailer and you then go spread it to someone else, that all contributes to a racially harassing workplace, and that we have to be mindful of. I wanted to talk about a particular case where we had an individual, Mr. George, who identified himself as a Black African Canadian. And the employer in this case was a general contractor who worked in the construction industry for many years. And the corporation was owned by an individual, Mr. Cito, who would supervise Mr. George and would work alongside him in the construction industry. And several occasions while at work, Mr. Cito actually called Mr. George the N-word or variations of the N-word, and would call him, I'm quoting from the decision, a monkey. He would also make comments where he would use the term like "you people" in reference to Mr. George. So he would say, "Do you people think? How can you people be so stupid to be rallying for each other and then shooting each other? What could make you people so stupid? What's wrong with you people?" And he denied some of those allegations, whereas he didn't deny all of them. And his defense in response to the application that Mr. George ultimately filed was he had said that he himself was of East Asian ancestry, and that he testified that racial slurs were common in the construction industry, and that he himself had been called racial slurs. So he had said, he gave evidence that he would tell all his workers, look, there may be some jokes, you may be subjected to some of these comments, but just, he would say, to let it roll off like water on a duck's back, that your job will be easier if you just let these comments go. And so the result of that was that Mr. George was subjected to these types of comments, both by who is his supervisor, but also colleagues. There was ultimately a performance issue on site where Mr. George was said to screw something up. And so Mr. Cito let him go. And Mr. George filed a complaint, a human rights complaint, alleging he was subjected to a racially poisoned work environment and that it constituted racial harassment. And he also alleged that his employment was terminated due to his race and color. And the tribunal found that the applicant's allegations when it came to the poisoned work environment were correct, and awarded him $20,000 in damages for injury to dignity and to feelings and to self-respect. The tribunal didn't find that the termination had to do with his race and color, but certainly that the comments contributed to a poisoned work environment. And the tribunal specifically said that this idea that everybody was called names and employees were told to just let it slide off their back was inconsistent with his responsibilities as an employer, and that when taken together, those comments constituted serious wrongful behavior that was persistent, that was repeated, and that an objective bystander would conclude there was a poisoned workplace environment and that he was subjected to it only because of his color and because of his race. And so I highlight this decision because and to the extent this is becoming less and less of a belief, but to the extent that it still exists, a pervasive culture of racism or the use of racial slurs on, say, construction sites will not allow an employer to ignore or to perpetuate racist attitudes in the workplace. And counseling our employees to ignore those comments or behaviors is insufficient. An employer must be proactive in receiving this type of information, investigating the type of terms, and to enacting steps to address those types of comments or the creation or maintenance of this type of environment. So to reiterate, before we to stay on the Human Rights Code, to emphasize the employer's legal obligations under the code is to maintain a discrimination-free workplace, including free from harassment. And while not required, we strongly recommend to have an anti-discrimination policy in place that sets out the code protections as well as everyone, including the co-workers' obligations. And look, I'll be frank, when a noose is found on a construction site, everyone is pointing the finger to everyone else. And immediately the question became, we need to have this discussion. We need to tackle this issue. We need to have more conversations. We need to have more training. We need to have more education. And that starts with an anti-discrimination policy, and it continues with anti-discrimination training. Because ultimately, who is responsible for the tone and the culture and the environment in our workplaces are us as the employer. So leaving aside the criminal issues, which we could talk about, there's undoubtedly going to be questions about, in the event that something happens, there will be questions about the environment, about comments, about jokes, about other decisions that were made that will be put under a magnifying glass. And we ought to have a policy that sets out our expectations, or that defines what is racism, what is discrimination, what is harassment. And it outlines who will receive a report of discrimination. Where does someone go if they feel like they've been experiencing racism in the workplace? And to say in black and white that it's completely unacceptable, that many of the comments that Richard said at the outset, having a policy that sets that tone and that will allow us to turn back, us and our employees and our workers to turn back to in the event there's an incident. So I'm moving now then to the Ontario Human Rights Code is one branch. The second branch is the Occupational Health and Safety Act. An employer is required under the Occupational Health and Safety Act to provide a safe work environment for its employees, and including an environment free from workplace violence and harassment. Now, we talked about harassment a little bit, but what's important to note is while under the Human Rights Code, harassment has to be tied to a protected ground, that's not the case in Occupational Health and Safety Act. Any form of harassment, no matter the reason, is protected by the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Now, the OSHA requires an employer to prepare policies and procedures with respect to workplace violence and harassment. We should already have it in place. And as many of us know, we're required to reassess and evaluate our workplace violence and harassment policies on an annual basis, or if there's a change in circumstances requiring a review. And I got to tell you, what we're seeing recently happen in construction sites is a circumstance that should be propelling us to go back to our workplace violence policies and see if we need to update our risk assessment to determine if there is a risk of a racial incident on our site. And if there is, what steps we are taking to address that risk. Under OSHA, workplace violence includes the exercise of physical force, an attempt to exercise physical force against a worker in a workplace that could cause physical injury. But then there's also a third branch to what constitutes workplace violence, which is a statement or behavior reasonable for a worker to interpret as a threat to exercise physical force against the worker in a workplace that could cause physical injury. And so you may have seen or heard of the recent incidences involving a noose where the police were involved, but the employers were saying, look, we're conducting our own investigation under our own health and safety policy. And that would very much, what we would very much need to consider in those examples is whether it falls under the definition of workplace violence, and particularly a statement or behavior that is reasonable for the worker to interpret as a threat to exercising physical force. Now, harassment, I talked about earlier, very much follows the definition under the Human Rights Code. So I won't spend too much more time on that, but I do want to emphasize some other examples, as I mentioned earlier, making remarks, jokes, innuendos, that demean, ridicule, intimidate, or offend. So, and I want to highlight, if there is conduct or comments in the work site that are attached to race, that's both a code issue, a human rights code, as well as an OSHA issue. But say, for example, someone is making comments or conduct that is not attached to race, but is still nonetheless harassment because it's remarks, jokes, innuendos that demean, ridicule, intimidate, or offend. That falls under OSHA and would need to be investigated under OSHA. So if somebody, for example, said, well, no, it had nothing to do with this person being Black or had nothing to do with me being white, It may very well be that that is the case, but it doesn't mean that we ought not to be responding to it, because we have our separate obligations under OSHA for simply workplace harassment. Now, harassment may include bullying, and I include some examples of what bullying is, which is isolating someone socially, undermining or deliberately impeding their work, so not, stealing their tools, hiding their tools, locking their tools, not giving them the keys to the site trailer, those types of things, or putting various stickers on their hard hat or on their boots with say a nickname. That can fall under the category of workplace bullying that may rise to the level of workplace harassment. So as many of us know, our obligations under OSHA, and we should have in place, and if we don't, we ought to get in place, is a policy with respect to workplace violence and harassment. And as I mentioned earlier, we must review them at least annually. And on top of that policy, we have to develop a workplace violence and workplace harassment program, where that program is intended to essentially give life to our workplace violence and harassment policies. And so I think the panel that follows me will very much be informative in how do we develop those programs. But as I mentioned earlier, we'll have to assess the risk of workplace violence in order to ensure that the policies and programs are effective, and we have to review them not only annually, but if there's a scenario that requires us to go back to those policies. And we have to provide our workers with appropriate information and instruction on these policies and programs. Look, we have to consider this issue as important as, say, working at heights. It is a topic that our workers ought to be informed on, instructed on, and supervised on, much like we are required to do on the other aspects of health and safety. So in our last little bit of time, I want to talk about, okay, well, what do we do? So I include responding to a report, but it can be responding to a report or responding to an incident of racial discrimination. No one wants to show up to a site and see what we've heard showing up on sites. But it also includes the other incidences of this person called me this name, or this person ridiculed me in this way, or somebody coming to us and saying, I feel uncomfortable, or I don't want to work with so-and-so, or I feel like this manager is particularly tough on me because of my race. What do we do in those types of scenarios? And so the first and foremost thing is our policies ought to be identifying who those reports go to. Who are we tasking with receiving the reports? I think there's this expectation that if workers have an issue, they'll raise it to their supervisor. But I'll be frank with you, I'm often seeing supervisors not raising it beyond that and dealing with it on their own. And it may not be consistent with what we wish to do in the event of a report or an incident. Or the supervisors may not have been adequately trained themselves on how to deal with the report. And so we have to think critically about who these reports should be going to, as well as involving our supervisors in the process, because no matter what our policy says, the reality is that some of our workers may raise it to the supervisors. So we want to put them in the best position on how to deal with it. As far as our obligations go, an employee, we are required to investigate it. If an employee brings a complaint or there is an incident involving a violation or alleged violation of human rights or workplace violence or workplace harassment. And it's not just enough for someone to say, for someone to say, well, there was no, I didn't receive a report, right? That no one came to me, there wasn't anything filed, I didn't see anything in writing, and so that's why I didn't investigate. That's not a full answer to it. If we have reason to believe that there was an incident that is occurring, that may trigger our obligation to investigate under either the Human Rights Code or the Occupational Health and Safety Act. So, and if we don't investigate, even if there isn't, say, a duty to investigate, if we don't and allow that environment to continue, we are ultimately responsible for that. So as I mentioned, if we receive, and this should be set out in our policy, but if we receive a report, we have to identify who the workers should bring their complaints to. We should be identifying how the incidents or complaints will be investigated, and then specify that the information we obtain about an incident or about a complaint, including identifying information, will not be disclosed unless it's necessary for the purposes of investigating or taking corrective action. Our policies should be emphasizing the confidentiality, because if you can imagine, it can be quite uncomfortable or feel very unsettling for someone to raise a report of racial discrimination. So we want to set or account for that in our policies. Certainly we can't promise confidentiality because it's possible we have to identify individuals for the purposes of, say, discipline or investigation, but we should provide as much comfort as we can so that people can feel comfortable. And then if we get an incident or if we get a report, we have to, as I say, investigate. And what that investigation looks like depends on the circumstances. And I'll suggest we should have whomever is investigating racial discrimination or harassment or workplace violence ought to be skilled, ought to be experienced in and knowledgeable on what the test is, what behavior is acceptable versus unacceptable, and how to conduct an appropriate and impartial and objective investigation. And certainly, we lean on professional investigators or legal counsel when we do have a scenario like that requires an investigation. Generally, as far as initial steps, when you receive a report or a complaint, we're picking up the phone and getting on our management team who's been tasked with handling these types of complaints. We're identifying who is going to conduct the investigation. We identify whether the police ought to be contacted, particularly if it's a hate crime. And then once we identify who should be contacted, getting everyone on the same page, then the question is who's investigating it. And as I say, the choice of an investigator is very important. And then that investigator will interview the individuals with the information, assess the evidence, and then make conclusions. And this is an important part. However small or big your investigation is, whoever's doing the investigation, there needs to be a closure to that investigation. We need to make our conclusion and we need to provide a report on our findings, because this matters to the people who are involved. If somebody raises a complaint or raises a report, having the response of we've looked into it, here we've either substantiated or unsubstantiated your complaints, here's why. And if we did find there was something, what are the steps that are being taken to address the situation? And I think that goes a long way in providing closure to the situation and allowing people to move forward and to move on and to feel more comfortable with having these types of discussions and raising perhaps more instances, because the ultimate goal is establishing that culture and that environment that's free from discrimination and harassment. So that concludes my formal comments. And as Amina said, I'm certainly open to questions and answers if anyone wishes to or feels comfortable to do so.
Yeah, so we've had a couple questions come in. No one's used the chat feature, but they've sent them to me directly. Someone used the chat feature. So the first one was at the start, Diane, you referenced racism was most likely to be reported in the workplace or with police. And the question was, is this racism in general, or was this specific to anti-Black racism?
Yeah, so I'll pull up the study and who it was done by. Give me 1 second here, because I don't want to misspeak.
Mm-hmm.
So it is among people who are Indigenous or Black.
Okay.
So discrimination this is a quote, page 41. The difference in treatment is evident across, discrimination due to one's race is a common experience in Canada, but it is most widespread among people who are Indigenous or Black. This difference in treatment is evident across a range of settings and situations, but most noticeably when it comes to dealing with the police and the workplace.
And what was the source again?
It is Navigating Race in Canadian Workplaces.
Okay, perfect. The other clarifying question was, I think you referenced union versus non-union workplaces, and I think there was a mention of 13% versus 8% visible minorities. I don't know if you have that off the top of your head.
Yeah, that is a December 2019 report, and it's called Demographics and Diversity, a Portrait of Ontario's, I'll slow down. Demographics and Diversity, a Portrait of Ontario's Unionized Construction Industry.
And I think we are lucky to have Jason Oddie from LiUNA 183, and they obviously are the largest union, especially in the residential sector, and so I'm sure we'll be able to get his experience and maybe some information from him. Another question, so this came from someone who is listening in. There's been an increased focus on mental health. Racism impacts mental health. How are the two legally related? So racism and mental health. And are there WSIB implications? And they specifically asked about traumatic mental stress and chronic mental stress.
Yeah, and this goes back to my earlier comment of, many employers were asking from a legal perspective of, the police investigation, the media coverage, and that's all, of course, very important. But there's also the effect of that it's having on our employees, and that includes the consideration of the mental health that it's having. Not just if there is an incident or an event, but having that culture or having that environment. And so certainly, if we're allowing a racial environment to exist, then that may very well affect their mental health, affect their willingness or desire to continue to subject themselves to that environment. And may it rise to the level of a disability? Quite possibly. And so under the Human Rights Code, you're not only dealing with an allegation of race, but then you may also be dealing with an allegation of disability if mental health rises to that. And certainly if the individuals, if there was a traumatic event that occurred in the workplace, then an individual may seek chronic mental stress benefits from the Workplace Safety and Insurance Board. I'm not sure if, well, I shouldn't say that. Harassment has been considered sufficient to constitute a traumatic event such that the individual is entitled to chronic mental stress benefits. So certainly if we have a scenario where someone is taking a leave of absence from work because of what they say is harassment or racial discrimination or anti-Black racism in the workplace, then that conversation is a live one as to whether or not this is a reportable workplace injury that ought to be reported to the WSIB and allowing them to investigate.
And I know we're pressing up against the clock, but I'm going to try and sneak one more in the question and answer function. It says, Diane spoke about the necessity of closure. Has there been any sort of closure in the incidents mentioned on the Toronto sites? I think Diane was speaking to closure of your investigation, that you as an employer need to close your investigation. I know that the Metrolink site, that one was resolved because the person resigned and is no longer within the workplace. I think the other ones were still under police investigation, and therefore I can't speak for the individual employers, but I don't believe the police have closed their investigations. But I'll turn it over to you, Diane, and this will be the last question.
Yeah, I won't speak to those specific scenarios involving the specific employers and situations, but certainly when it comes to closing our investigation, when we are conducting an investigation under OSHA for workplace harassment or workplace violence, we are required to communicate our findings to the individuals involved. And so not only is there a legal obligation to bring closure to the investigation, there's certainly a legal obligation where if we've conducted an investigation, we have to communicate the findings. Now, when we get to that point where we're able to provide findings, that's one issue. I think the OSHA allows us 30 days unless the circumstances warrant a longer time period. But certainly there's a legal obligation to communicate findings, but also a non-legal obligation. As I say, this has a profound impact on the people who are involved. And so we have to have respect for that. And that respect entails us giving a genuine effort to responding to the incident or to the environment and identifying what has been substantiated and what has not. And if there have been substantiated, or even if there isn't, what steps are being taken to address the situation? So is there training? Are there seminars? Is there discipline? Is there a reconfiguration? Those are all things that the individuals who are involved are not only legally entitled to under OSHA, but I think deserve. They need to have that type of information. And so we ought not to be just receiving a report and saying, oh, I talked to the person and everything is fine, without circling back to the person who was the subject of the comment or conduct.
Okay, I'll turn it back over to Amina.
Okay, so we're going to get started with the panel. I know some of you guys joined us late, so I'm just going to reintroduce myself quickly. My name is Amina Dib. I will be moderating the panel. I'm a programs and policy analyst at RESCON, and in this role, I work with a lot of our post-secondary partners to help create opportunities for young people, including women and people from racialized communities, start their careers in the skilled trades and construction management. So following racially motivated incidents on construction sites in the GTA, we saw a lot of organizations rethink their diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism policies, many just choosing to implement policies. All three of our panelists today, however, represent and work for organizations that have long-standing anti-racism, diversity, and inclusion policies, practices, and initiatives. I'm now going to turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Jason and ending with Danielle. And within your introduction, I'm going to ask that you tell us a bit more about why you're passionate about this issue of anti-racism, diversity, and inclusion, and briefly speak more about how anti-racism, diversity, and inclusion is crucial to your overall organizational goals and missions. So starting again with Jason, and then we'll go to Fatima and then Danielle.
Hi everyone, Jason Audi with LaUna Local 183. I am the Director of Government Relations and Communications here at the local. LaUna 183 has a membership of about 60,000, broadly spread out through the GTA. I think one of the strengths of LaUna and 183 in particular is our diversity. We were literally founded as a voice of the unseen, and that legacy has been at 183 and LaUna from the get-go. So it's a focus in terms of making sure that opportunities exist for everybody, in particular racialized youth, and we have a number of and indigenous people, and we have a number of programs that we've started over the years to ensure that opportunities in construction are afforded to these people. Just speaking more broadly, I'm interested in having a conversation with all the panelists because Diane's presentation really did raise, I think, some really unique opportunities that we have to raise the issue of racism and discrimination in the workplace and in construction. And there's some tools there that I think we can avail ourselves to tie this thing together and really shine a light on discrimination and racism in the workplace and provide a safe environment for people to raise concerns that they have. I think one of the biggest things that we experience is we always find out after the fact. And that's because there's always this fear of recrimination and a reprisal, of raising situations at the workplace to their supervisor. They're concerned that that it will blow back on them. And so here at 183, that's one of the things that our reps do very well, is to tell them that if there is an issue, you have to raise it with us so that we can raise it to the employer and start the conversation. If we're not aware that these things are occurring, then we can't address them. So having that conversation and feeling and creating an environment where people feel that they won't be penalized for speaking up is, I think, a critical first step. I mean, this is important to me. It's important to 183 for a number of reasons, but I really do think probably the most important aspect is the fact that construction provides a pathway for amazing opportunities and income. And all too often we're seeing that people are left on the margins, and being left on the margins exposes them to a degree of inequality. So if we can raise people out of social and economic inequality, we can address bigger issues around fairness. And so as a starting point, by having a policy of inclusion and making really strong efforts to reach out to those who are underrepresented in the trades, I think we can address the issue of racism in construction in a meaningful way.
Okay, so Fatima, if you want to.
Thank you. Yeah, so my name is Fatima Saya. I'm the manager of community partnerships at the Daniels Corporation. And, you know, the community partnerships team is really the team that's on the ground, building relationships and collaborating with the communities that we're building in across the GTA. And it really encapsulates, or my role encapsulates, everything from community engagement to social infrastructure development to community economic development initiatives. And you know, the reality is that race and racial justice is a cross-cutting issue in each of these areas. Racial inequality is a reality, you know, as Diana was talking about, in Canada, Ontario, Toronto. It's a reality here. And inclusive, equitable, and sustainable community development can't occur without an acknowledgement of this and finding ways to address it. So, you know, that's something that really is a part of my role at Daniels. In terms of, you know, why I'm passionate about this or where that comes from, I've worked in diversity in education actually for a number of years in sort of my past life, and consulted with nonprofit organizations, you know, creating policies around LGBTQ health and food insecurity in the city. And so it's an area I've been passionate about for a number of years. And I'm really grateful to be able to work with an organization and a private sector developer builder, no less, that recognizes how important these issues are. You know, at Daniels, we really see ourselves as having a real responsibility to do our best as city builders. And what that means is, in addition to ensuring the quality of the communities that we're building, so in addition to the bricks and mortar buildings, we're also looking at investing in and supporting social, cultural, and economic infrastructures, right? And those are the things that we think also help sustain communities and make them stronger and more resilient. So that includes everything like affordable housing, which we've built for many years, and urban agriculture, which creates opportunities in diverse communities in Toronto, for example, or the GTA, to grow culturally relevant foods. And it also includes things like social procurement that we've worked on, and youth and training programs. And you know, I take Jason's point on this. It's incredibly important. And you know, I'm going to talk about social procurement really quickly, just because it's an easy example, but a highly impactful example, and something we've been working on for a long time. So you know, as a builder, we procure a huge amount of artwork, for example, for our projects. And while that serves to beautify our spaces on the one hand, it also, we see it as an opportunity to engage in economic development for artists. So it's not about working with well-established or international artists for us. It's about creating opportunities for emerging artists or artists from equity-seeking groups. So artists who may be racialized or indigenous or women or LGBTQ artists. And it's about creating those opportunities and engaging and recognizing that that talent exists and finding ways to elevate that in the work that we do, and including diversity and inclusion in the way that we run our business and really integrating it.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it to Danielle now to introduce herself. You're on mute, Danielle.
Thank you, Amina. And I'm Danielle, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Brand Experience at Tridel. And before I start, I just want to thank RESCON for hosting the panel discussion today and for taking this leadership role and making sure as an industry, we're taking steps to address what is arguably one of the most complex, nuanced social dilemmas we face, both at work and, of course, in our daily lives. This made all the more challenging because it's so hard for many of us to talk about racism and discrimination. It has so much tension and anxiety, and it's so emotionally charged, it becomes difficult to address. And these problems are also, it's compounded because they're complex, confused, or obscured. But the outcomes to the people that experience racism and other acts of discrimination certainly are not. As we've heard earlier from Richard and Diane in some of the discussions today. So I thank you, Richard, Amina, Andrew, and my other panelists for inviting Tridel to exchange in these perspectives, because through these exchanges, if we know better, we can do better. And so getting to my work at Tridel and how it relates. As part of my role, I'm responsible for the external and internal customer experiences. So that includes our employees through people and culture, our direct customers through our design, home orientation, warranty. Plus, as the leader of corporate social responsibility at Tridel, I direct community-based initiatives across the greater GTA. And a bit like what Fatima was describing is that we look at community economic development as part of a sacred responsibility that we have to give back to every community where we build, because they are what keep us strong and going and great. So this idea of, you know, making sure that we create employment programs for youth and the different art-based programs and our Bowery project. These are all critical initiatives for Tridel. I'm specifically focused on working to preserve the best of our values-driven high-performance culture at Tridel, while trying to innovate or evolve those areas where we need to grow. And certainly ensuring a zero tolerance of racism, which I applaud RESCON for taking such a strong position on, and educating our workforce on a greater awareness of and understanding of these issues. We call it BAD behavior. It's an acronym. I love acronyms, which my team will tell you, but it's bullying, harassment, abuse, and discrimination. So that is a part of what I do. And I lead and have built a very diverse team of over 60 employees who are both diverse in both thought and their backgrounds. So I can assure you, especially with recent events, they are engaged with and very passionate about the issue. And they expect Tridel as an employer, especially as a builder, a city builder of communities, where we have wonderfully diverse consumers and customers where they live. They expect us to be so too. So, and Tridel is. Without getting too much into the detail, and I think we mirror a lot of, you know, the initiatives that Daniel does, and think they're amazing. With recent events, we looked inward and immediately established a Built for Love, Not Hate employee-driven group. And so it was really a starting point, because as good as we think we are, and we've been around for 80 years, we like to say we're 80 years young, we wanted to just sit back and listen and not jump publicly into the conversation, but to sit back and hear what our employees, what their views and experiences were. I think Jason referred to creating that safe space. I love that. And we realized that, you know, we could do better at that. So we called it a safe and brave space where our employees could come and share information about their experiences in our workplace. And we didn't actually limit it to that. We just wanted to share how they felt their life experiences were. And we brought in an amazing facilitator, Agapi Jasesi from, I would highly recommend her from C, who really helped us get that conversation going. And I think Diane mentioned getting some professional help for some areas where, you know, you really haven't treaded too far. And since March, our company's committed to every employee in the company to training and education. And I think that's a bit of what all three of the panelists so far have touched on in their opening statements. This respect in the workplace training, plus other steps like forming a diversity, equity, inclusion group, is something that we've added to existing groups that we have that will keep us focused and action-oriented. And in closing, on a personal note, I'm an American, raised for the most part in the US, and I'm part of a very diverse multicultural family. I've been fortunate to live my adult life mostly in Canada and to have personally experienced the differences in social systems and what force they can have on individuals and cultures in many subtle and insidious ways. I often thought my family gave me this greater understanding and appreciation of this issue of racism and the topic. And in many ways it did, but especially recently, talk about humility. I've had to learn there's so much more to do and know, and it's very humbling. So thank you again to everyone and my panelists for having me here. So I can learn and share and do a better job at Tridel, but in general, just be a better human being. So thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. Also fellow American here, so.
Shout out.
Yeah. So just being cognizant of time with the next couple of questions. So the next question is for Fatima. What was Daniel's response to the recent incident on site? And can you tell us a bit more about Daniel's relationship with the Regent Park community?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, our response to the incident on our construction site really began immediately on June 26th. And that was the day the news was found. And, you know, it was an immediate filing of a police report, but also a very strong statement from Daniel's president, Mitchell Cohen. And what was so important about that statement was that it came directly from the top, of course, and it emphasized that Daniel's really takes this issue seriously and knows that there's a zero tolerance for this type of racism. But equally important was that it was really unequivocal in naming what this incident was, and that it was an act of racism and a hate crime, and not just any hate crime, but one that was directly perpetrated against the Black community. And that was a really important sort of first initial part of our initial response. And, you know, in addition to that, and I think this is a really interesting and important question, because when we think about responses, we're often thinking about the immediate term or a one-time response. And the reality is that short-term responses, especially when we're dealing with issues as complex and really as complex as racism and issues that have been around for such a long time, a short-term solution isn't actually enough. And, you know, that really meant that Daniel's response has been and has had to have been, if we were really looking at addressing this, an ongoing response. It has to be ongoing. So, of course, in the immediate days and weeks that followed, you know, we held tool talks with all of the workers, not just on the site where the incident occurred, but all of our sites across the GTA. And we were joined not only by our executive team at those talks, but also union and industry representatives. And, you know, so in addition to responding to the incident itself, we're just engaging with diversity, equity, and inclusion internally with our organizational policies and processes and culture, and then also engaging with the industry as well. And so we have these three areas, really, you know, the incident itself internally, and then with the industry, where we're working to tackle racism as a whole in the industry to the best that we can with partners and other stakeholders that we work with, right? So that's really what the basics of the incident itself. And of course, you know, Amina, you're asking about Regent Park, and the reality is that, you know, the community in which this incident occurred is a community where we have a really long history. It's a community where we've worked for the past 15 years really closely with communities on the types of initiatives that I was mentioning earlier, right, around social infrastructure development and local economic development. You know, and I know that Danielle's going to get into this because Tridel also has similar programs, right, around youth employment and thinking about the kinds of opportunities that are being provided to not just, you know, youth in under-resourced, marginalized communities like social housing communities in Regent Park, but also thinking about how, you know, coming back to this idea of how race is a cross-cutting issue, how oftentimes in these communities that we're working in, the majority of individuals that we're collaborating with or working with in communities are racialized. And that's sort of an understanding that we have to have up front. And so in Regent Park specifically, you know, it's been a really amazing way to continue working with the community, naming racism as an issue and being really open to just continue to innovate around how we deal with this together. And luckily we have an amazing partnership with folks in the community. And that's been an incredible opportunity to continue working on that relationship.
Thank you. I just want to kind of make a comment here. I think that Danielle and Fatima, your commentary and discussion about what Tridel and Daniel says is very refreshing, because I think some people listening in who aren't part of the builder developer community, they don't know, or they may not be familiar with all the work that you guys do beyond just building homes for people. So thank you for that. On that note, the next question is for Danielle. So you guys have programs like Building Opportunities for Life, also known as BOLT, and you do a fair bit of work with Toronto Community Housing. How has that impacted how you recruit, train, and retain workers? Oh, sorry, and I think Jason has a comment.
Sorry, I just wanted to echo what you were saying about the work of Daniels and Tridel, particularly around the noose at the Daniels site. I mean, that happened and we're dealing with it, but I think what was more telling was how Daniels dealt with it, right? And this is something I think we should all take from this experience, is that acts of discrimination and racism are going to occur, but the real value and what we really learn about how companies deal with it is how they respond. They didn't, and they were unequivocal. They didn't try and hide it, and they embraced it, and they said, "This is how we're going to deal with it." And I think that it was a model for other companies to look to, right? And it's only in creating that environment where employees can feel safe to raise these issues that we can actually have a conversation about it. I was part of the speakers that went to all the job sites that Daniels had and spoke to each and every one of the workers to reconfirm every organization's commitment around resolving anti-Black and racism on the job site and in society. So I just wanted to sort of do a shout out to the both of you and your organizations for doing exceptional work.
Thank you for that. Sorry I missed your hand initially. And I'll let Danielle talk more about BOLT and their relationship with Toronto Community Housing.
Thanks, Amina. And Jason, I just want to mirror what you said to Fatima and the Daniels Corporation. The fact that they responded so quickly and with a show of such a strong public statement is an example for all of us to live by. Sometimes the reaction is to move slowly, too thoughtfully, and some of it is to take that really public position and then very openly share in the solution and engage a number of people in it. So I think that more like that. I thought that was fantastic. I also want to touch on something that Diane had said too before I jump into both, but it was about the question around mental health and the association or the dynamic at play there. One of the things that we have really fallen into is this, at Tridel, and some of what we're focusing in on our training is the attention to unconscious bias, which is a filter with which we all view the world. We all have them. But how that plays into this dynamic of racism and microaggressions, little things that Diane was talking about, jokes and things that seem like it's a norm within the culture of construction or in our workplace, that jokes that aren't so funny, whether it's about race or, there was an example someone gave of yelling across, "Hey, fat boy." And it was one of those things that was just so like, that's not right, And each of these microaggressions we had learned from this gentleman, his name's Indy Jakar, highly recommend it, Dark Matter Labs. He does a lot of research in this area, and he talked about literally not just the mental health toll microaggressions take, whether it's targeted at anybody for any reason, but it actually takes a toll on your lifespan. And they were showing that people from the Black community have a demonstratively shorter lifespan because of the microaggressions they face over their entire life. So I thought that was something that was very interesting and wanted to share that. Getting into building opportunities for life. It's a passion of mine. It's if I go back, I think, to when you asked me, what is it in terms of how did it affect our recruiting and our training and our retention? We at Tridel we learn the most from our customers and our employees, and this is no different. The precursor vote started around a conversation around the silver tsunami, and it was at a Children's Aid event where our president was talking to their executive director about sort of these wonderfully talented people who didn't see themselves at university. And we were experiencing, we're in the middle of a talent war. And so it just started in a natural conversation of, wow, we have an ability to have a different talent pool possibly. And the construction industry, as we all know, some things have barriers to getting into the job force. Well, we have physical barriers. We have fences and hoarding, and it's very hard for if someone even has an interest to even penetrate that. So when it came to recruiting, it was necessity is the mother of invention, a bit through this work, talent shortage. But it also became something that was so beautifully elegant by just opening up conversations in community and taking days of discovery and bringing people in from all across different neighborhoods in Toronto, specifically youth from sort of marginalized communities. We were able to start an awareness, and through that awareness, we partnered with George Brown, and I know they're here today, so shout out to George Brown. But they really helped us form the precursor of what became the Building Opportunities for Life Today program, which fast forwarded 10 years later, we are giving out scholarships and training and opportunities to shadow and visit our job sites. And from that, go to programs where we can actually place them into a union job. And where previously there wasn't that pathway to education, training, and our workplaces. So from a recruitment point of view, it was something that was tremendously a win-win for everyone involved. In terms of training and retention, I would say it's not just retention and training of the youth that we were bringing into our company that was diverse, but it was also this aspect of training the employees that have been here. And Tridel has quite a tenured workforce. You're just starting if you're at 5 years, and we have a whole huge cohort that is 10 to 20 years plus. So when we bring in this diversity of thought into our company, we learn so much about our existing culture and ways to improve it. So one of the examples is this idea of shadowing and exploring and innovating sort of career trajectory. So exposing through visiting different areas in our company through the shadowing experience. We started doing this internally and even to move the Bolt youth along. But also the sensitivity that training that came working with more youth and community. It was something that we realized our employees needed to have a better context of understanding, just the basic differences of culture and what that means in the workplace, and how to make sure we create more opportunity and more openness to learning, as opposed to this defensiveness and withdrawal. So with that, both and working with Toronto Community Housing has been a tremendous journey. We, like Daniels, enjoy the partnership we have at Alexandra Park, and continue to look forward to expanding our understanding and doing more, not just in Tridel, but in the communities where we build.
Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you.
So the last question is for Jason. LEUNA 183, among many other things, trains the GTHA's next generation of construction workers. How is anti-racism built into each training curriculum and course?
I mean, I think one of the things that resulted from the incident at Daniels and the other sites was a deep dive into how we are actually addressing anti-racism and discrimination in our training courses and our skills courses. And one of the things that we quickly realized was that it wasn't part of a specific module. It wasn't something that we talked about as part of an apprenticeship program, and we realized that we should. And so we're working now with our training center to develop a mandatory, I call it a module, but it's almost more of a course on anti-racism and discrimination in the workplace, what your rights are, similar to what Diane laid out, but also putting it in the context of what it means to be a member of LEUNA and what our policy as an organization is. I mean, it did allow, one of the things we did was issue a very strong statement about zero tolerance towards discrimination and racism in the workplace, and from a member standpoint, that member to member discrimination and racism can potentially result in expulsion from the membership, from being a member, as sort of a way to highlight how important that was. So from our standpoint, one of the things we're trying to do is develop that module. It's something that I believe would have to be delivered from a social equity enterprise. It's not something one of our trainers can offer. It's going to be something that would be required to move into your phase 2 of your apprenticeship. And then as we build that out, start talking about how we can embed these things in our skills courses where members come in for their health and safety training, but that's further down the road. The other thing that we looked at as an organization is how can we explore ways to make some quick hits to make sure that people are having these conversations around this issue. And so one of the things that we are exploring with some of our employer partners is to start a campaign with the provincial government about embedding the same type of treatment that we do for workplace harassment and violence in terms of coming up with a program, having a similar program and obligation for employers to do that for discrimination and racism. And seeing where we can embed that, not just in the education system in terms of potentially tying it to the civics and careers course that everybody going through secondary school is required to do, but also perhaps tying it to our Occupational Health and Safety Act and the tools that we have through the Joint Health and Safety Committee. Is there a way to empower those individuals to conduct these types of investigations? So, this is a continuing dialogue here. We are also having all of our conversations with our shop stewards, which has been difficult because of COVID, and our business reps, just sort of reconfirming what 183's role is in representing the interests of a member. When a member raises a concern, that it's a concern that has to be dealt with, and that they will do everything in their power to get the issue resolved. The one thing that I've seen in my time here is that, one, we have to make sure that the members know they have an opportunity to speak, and that they can raise these issues with their business rep and not feel like that they will be penalized. But the other thing that I will say is that as we reach out to new people to join the unionized world, and in particular LAUNA, it's incumbent on us to tell them how to navigate our world, right? So oftentimes we've had apprentices who where the work has slowed down because they're apprentices, they're often laid off, and they're not sure where to go to find their next job. People who are working in the union environment know, they call the rep, and the rep helps them get placed. And oftentimes they didn't know that. So that's one of the areas that we're trying to create more knowledge about what it means to be a member of LAUNA 183, and how do you get the best experience here.
Thank you, Jason. So we are past 3, but I'm not going to let that stop us and you guys from making some closing remarks. So please, to the attendees, give us a bit more time because what we have to say is extremely important. So I'm going to start with Fatima and with Jason with this last question. And again, being cognizant of time. Where do you see this conversation and overall issue going? And what long-term outcomes would you like to see? Again, starting with Fatima and ending with Jason.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, trying to pull together some of the different parts of this conversation that we're having. And I think one that really sticks out to me with what Jason was talking about in terms of how the training and really embedding knowledge and an understanding of, you know, members' rights, but also just understanding that people have a voice, and diversity and inclusion is important, and it's important to the industry, it's important to the unions, it's important to builders and contractors, and I think that that's such an important piece that kind of ties all of this together, because, you know, we're talking about the work that Tridel and Daniels is doing in local economic development and social infrastructure, and it's great if, you know, Danielle's team through Bolt and Daniels through the craft program that we participate in with the College of Carpenters, if we're able to bring people from these communities, from racialized communities, into the industry and give them experience, but if where they're ending up isn't an environment where they feel comfortable or welcomed or where they have a voice, that it won't necessarily make as much of a difference. Like, this really has to be a collaborative effort. And I think that for me is a really important takeaway here, that, you know, this same concept of, you know, when we're dealing with this incident, thinking about, okay, the incident, but also internally how we're dealing with it, and then how we're dealing with it as an industry and working together to address it. And that's something that really Daniels is eager to do, to continue to collaborate with the unions and with the associations and partners, and just working together to overcome this issue.
Thank you. And Danielle, what do you want people to take away from this?
I think building upon both what Jason and Fatima said is and they both said it in a slightly different way, but, you know, this whole issue, it's not about an event. It's something that, you know, is a system, and it's going to take, I heard an expression, and I highly recommend this woman, Dr. Robin DiAngelo, who wrote a book called White Fragility, but it was around this whole concept of, you know, it's so pervasive, and this idea of just even creating stamina, sort of a racial stamina, to have this conversation and look for every opportunity to enhance our understanding. So we're not going to do this alone. You're not going to do it in isolation of your own company. And even as our industry, there's so much impact we can have, is to draw on every resource like RESCON, and what the opportunity you've created for us today is to stay active and involved in the conversation, push back, you know, on this, you know, if we're comfortable, we're probably not getting at the root cause that Richard originally, I think, referenced, and that we're in it for the long term. And it will be evolutionary and transformational to our industry, and we will be better for it, for sure. So I really appreciate the opportunity of being here today, and thank you, Mina. You've done a wonderful job moderating. So, and to all of my panelists as well, thank you.
Okay. And Jason?
Yeah, thanks again, Amina, and the folks at RESCON for setting it up. It's been an excellent conversation, and I'm really glad that I had the opportunity to participate. You know, where do we end up on this? I mean, I think one of the things that I really take encouragement from is that there no longer is a question of, does racism exist? It seems like we've gotten past that now, and it's taken a long time. And now really the question is okay, racism does exist. How do we prevent it? How do we solve it? And you know, the white fragility comment sort of made me giggle, because I've had these conversations with colleagues and friends, and I said, just because you might acknowledge that racism exists doesn't make you a racist, right? And so if we can have those conversations, and we can get past this idea of it's an indictment of myself, by sort of tiptoeing into this space. If that's no longer an issue, then there's a lot of great minds and ideas that we can put forward to resolve them. I think education is key. That's not just for supervisors and employers. It's also for other employees. The second piece that I think is critical is on the outreach side. We're doing a lot to outreach to sort of diverse groups, to bring more people into the construction industry. But oftentimes I feel like perhaps they're feeling that they're not getting that message. And so we have to do a better job, I think, as an organization. And we do a lot. I mean, we do a lot in terms of reaching out to diverse groups and underrepresented groups in the industry to try and bring them in. But unfortunately, there are some challenges, and I think we need to have a discussion around what those wraparound supports are that perhaps aren't needed in other groups that are needed here. I mean, we just recently through our training center launched, I think, our third Women in Construction class, partnering with ACON.
Nice.
And you know, it is a class of women, all very diverse, but there were challenges there that we had to address and had to work around. And so being different doesn't make it any less equal. And so I think that's the conversations that we need to start. I'd like to see the construction industry really embrace diversity, I think on a wider scale than it has, not just from an organizational standpoint, but other unions, I think, as well, can step up to the plate and offer opportunities for people who didn't think that they could get there. Having clear pathways in the construction industry is also going to be critical. Oftentimes, when you talk to a long-standing member, you ask them, how did they start their careers? It was, you know, through my uncle and my brother. And if you don't have that connection, it's really hard to get through. And so what we've done through our training series is to create clear pathways and intakes to encourage people to come in and start their careers. So I think those are the things that I'd like to see. And I don't think this is a conversation that's going to end, unfortunately. And I think the more we talk about it, the better we're going to be. So just want to thank everybody and the participants for being part of this. It's been great.
Thank you, Jason. And thank you, Fatima and Danielle, for very intriguing and educational discussion. I'm going to turn it over to Richard to deliver some closing remarks. But before I do that, I just want to mention whenever RESCON does events, in lieu of gifts to the panelists and the presenters, we try and make a donation to an organization or charity. So following today's webinar, we'll be making a donation to St. Clair's Multi-Faith Housing Society. St. Clair's is an affordable housing provider in Toronto for people who've experienced homelessness. Richard, I'll let you deliver some closing remarks, but thanks again to all the panelists and Diane for that much needed first conversation. So thanks. Richard, I'll hand the mic over to you virtually.
Thank you. Thank you, Amina, and great job. Jason, soon it will be through the aunt and the mother rather than the uncle and the father.
Fair enough.
Actions we come from, we can only aspire to that because that's where we need to go. So look, I wanted to say something here, and that is that I don't think there are any racists on this call, or at least I hope not. And if there are, hopefully we change their minds. But I doubt that. I say that in jest. But in all sincerity, you know, we immediately responded with zero tolerance right off the bat. I didn't even have to talk to anybody. That was the message. And if you're caught, you're gone, right? You're fired. So that's good. But the tough challenge ahead for us, I think, and where I think I want our roundtable to go, that's going to include organized labor, industry, government, and so on, is to find meaningful ways to get to the people and maybe save them that are in our industry to think differently about this. If they have racial inclinations or racist inclinations, you know, that kind of thing, that we can change their minds. And I think that's where success is. And of course, that all starts from the top. It's got to be a commitment right from the top, and it has to be unequivocal. And I think it is. I'm not saying everybody is, you know, obviously we have an issue, so we're dealing with it. And, but that's where the rubber is gonna hit the road, is when we can change hearts and minds, not printed policies, not more process, but it's actually getting to the root of the problem. And that is gonna be the task of the roundtable. And that should be the only task of the roundtable. It's not gonna be the triumph of form over substance. It's gonna be a meaningful exercise. So I want to thank the panelists again. Amina did that. Diane, you, again, just, you're wonderful. What can I say? Amina, you did a great job pulling this together, and I really appreciate everyone else that joined in on this webinar. This is the beginning, not the end. This is not a knee-jerk reaction to an immediate problem or whatever else like that. We've got full commitment from, you know, our governance structure and so on to proceed with this. And we believe in it, and we will, and we look forward to your ongoing participation and support in this. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your afternoon.
I thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.